Hello everyone, today we are back with another great video, Family Ties Beyond Measure. Please support me every day so I can bring out more meaningful videos for you. The ungrateful son kicks his father out of the house and the shocking truth. The fog still lingered on the narrow road leading into the town where Matthew's family lived. The scene was bathed in the soft light of early morning, as the first rays of the new day gently touched the earth. The trees cast shadows on the wet pavement, and the houses stood silently, as though waiting for the day to begin. But for Jack, Matthew's elderly father in his 70s, those days no longer held joy or hope. The house that he had once called home, the place that had witnessed so many beautiful family memories, now felt strange, quiet, and cold. Each step he took, each heavy breath he struggled to make, seemed to bother the son he loved more than anything. In the past, Jack had been a strong man, a father who gave everything for his children. He had dedicated his life to his family, sacrificing his own dreams to ensure that his son, Matthew, would have a bright future. But now, with old age robbing him of his health, he felt like he no longer had a place in that house. His trembling hands could no longer firmly grip the household objects, his weak legs made it difficult for him to move easily, and he realized that his son, already so busy with work, no longer had the patience to care for him. Above all, he understood that he had become a burden to Matthew, who always had a frown on his face whenever Jack unintentionally disrupted the daily chores around the house. Jack didn't blame Matthew, at least that's what he told himself. He understood that old age had taken away his sharpness and his strength, and that was why he couldn't live the life he once did. He knew that he was now just a shadow in this house, a place that used to echo with the laughter and happiness of a family. But what hurt Jack the most was not the changes in himself, but the change in his son's attitude. Matthew was no longer the kind-hearted child who loved his father, but had become a cold, indifferent, and impatient man. Jack began to feel that perhaps Matthew had wanted him to leave for a long time. As the days went by, Jack couldn't help but wonder if his presence had become a burden too heavy for his son to bear. The house that had once been filled with warmth and love now seemed like a place of exile, a reminder of how time and circumstances had altered the relationship between a father and his child. Jack tried to maintain his dignity and accept the reality of his situation, but the pain in his heart was undeniable. He had always believed that family was everything, but now, in his old age, he was beginning to question whether that belief still held true. Longing for the past. The more Jack reflected, the more he realized how much he missed the days when Matthew was a little boy, full of life and affection. The days when he would hold his father's hand with trust and warmth, the times when they would play together and laugh freely. Jack had worked tirelessly to give Matthew everything he needed, to provide him with opportunities that he never had. But now, all that seemed to have been forgotten, lost in the face of his son's growing indifference. As Jack spent his days in solitude, he came to a painful conclusion: maybe it was time for him to leave. Maybe, just maybe, his presence in the house was only a reminder of the past, a past that Matthew was eager to forget. But even then, Jack couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. After all, he had given everything for his son, and yet, in his moment of need, he found himself abandoned. But even though his heart was heavy with sorrow, Jack did not seek to confront Matthew. He only wished for the peace that had long eluded him. Jack knew that it was not easy for his son either, and perhaps Matthew had his own burdens to bear, ones that Jack could never fully understand. The passage of time had not been kind to either of them, and the father could only hope that one day, Matthew might realize the sacrifices he had made. The shocking truth. Little did Jack know that Matthew was struggling too. Behind his cold exterior, he was fighting his own demons. The demands of work, the pressures of being a father himself, and the responsibilities of life had begun to weigh on him. But instead of finding solace in his father's presence, he had built walls around himself, shutting out the one person who had always been there for him. What Matthew didn't understand was that his father's sacrifices had been made out of love, not obligation. This reality would eventually be brought to light, in a way that Matthew could never have anticipated. The shock of discovering the extent of his father's sacrifices would force him to confront his own shortcomings, and the painful truth of his actions would become a turning point in their relationship. That morning, as Jack struggled to get out of his old, creaky bed and make breakfast for the family, he only wished to do something small to help his son and daughter-in-law. For the years he had lived under Matthew and Emily's roof, relying on their kindness, Jack didn't want to remain a mere dependent in his own home. He longed to contribute, no matter how small, to maintain the warm atmosphere of the family. Yet, while he clumsily poured tea into a delicate porcelain cup, his hands could not retain their steadiness. A glass cup fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. The sound of the glass breaking was a clear sign that everything in his life was no longer as it once was. Matthew, emerging from his room, wore a scowl on his face, his frustration unmistakable. He was tired of the small accidents his father seemed to cause over and over again. "Can't you be more careful? You're always in the way." His voice was sharp and cold, as if the shattered cup didn't even deserve a second thought. Jack bowed his head, picking up the shards of glass, beads of sweat on his forehead, trying his best to do things as he once had. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to help," he said in a faint voice, as if he had grown used to offering apologies that no one ever bothered to listen to. But Matthew had no time for apologies. He interrupted his father with a cold, cutting remark. "Help? You just make everything a mess. This house isn't a place for you to cause chaos. If you can't take care of yourself, maybe you should just leave." These words weren't just a display of anger, they were cruel, indifferent, and heartless. They severed the bond between father and son that had lasted for so many years. Jack stood there silently, his dull eyes filled with pain. He looked up at Matthew, his lips trembling as he asked, "Do you want me to leave?" His voice was nearly choked, but those words slipped out anyway. Matthew turned away without a word, without offering any explanation or comfort. Jack's footsteps echoed through the cold house, each one heavy and laden with humiliation. Despite having spent his entire life for his son, he was now being kicked out of the very place that had once been his home. The next day, Jack stepped out of the house he had called home for decades. The house, once filled with warmth and memories, now stood cold and silent, its walls holding only the bitter recollections of a life that seemed to have faded away. Jack didn't have much to take with him, just an old cloth bag holding a few faded clothes and a family photo that had long since lost its color with the passing of time. Outside the window, the rain fell steadily, each drop seeming to mirror his mood. Every step he took felt heavier, burdened by the weight of past regrets and the uncertain future that awaited him. "I'm leaving now, Matthew," Jack said softly, knowing his son would never hear these words. He wasn't expecting a farewell, nor did he long for one. He simply walked, leaving everything behind, including the family that had once meant the world to him. As he walked down the road, his body ached, not just from the physical exertion but from the emotional toll of being pushed out of his own home. The rain continued to fall, as if nature itself understood the sorrow he felt. Each drop was like a tear, reflecting the loss and the emptiness that Jack carried in his heart. The streets, usually familiar and comforting, now felt like a foreign path leading him into an unknown future. Jack didn't know where he was going. He only knew that he couldn't stay in the place where he had spent so many years raising his son, only to be cast aside in his time of need. With no direction in mind, he wandered, his steps slow and deliberate, each one taking him further away from the place he once called home. He passed by familiar landmarks, but everything now seemed distant, as if life had moved on without him. The world outside was unchanged, but to Jack, it felt like everything had shifted, and he was no longer a part of it. His heart was heavy with grief, and though he tried to remain strong, the weight of his sorrow was almost unbearable. At the end of the street, he found a bench in a park, an old, worn bench that seemed to have witnessed countless stories of people coming and going. Jack sat down, the cold of the metal seeping into his bones, but it didn't matter. He didn't feel the cold in the way he used to. Instead, his mind was consumed by thoughts of Matthew, the son he had raised, the son who had cast him aside so easily. He wondered how things had gone so wrong, how the man he had once held in his arms as a child could now turn away from him without a second thought. Was it his fault? Had he failed as a father? Or had the years of sacrifice and love simply faded into nothingness, leaving nothing behind but bitterness? The rain continued to fall, and Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tears blend with the rain. In that moment, he wasn't sure where the pain ended and the rain began. But what he knew was that, in that moment of solitude, he could finally reflect on the life he had lived and the family he had loved. He didn't have the answers, but he had memories, memories of better times when laughter filled the house and love was the glue that held them all together. Now, those memories felt distant, like a dream that could never be reclaimed. As the hours passed, Jack stayed on that bench, lost in thought, waiting for something, perhaps a sign, or perhaps just the end of the day. But all he received was the endless sound of the rain and the silence that filled his heart. Jack walked outside, through the empty streets drenched in rain. The leaves on the trees fell one by one, drifting along the water like pieces of memories that could never be gathered again. He didn't know where he was going, but that no longer mattered. His steps were slow, as if he were walking through a dream, a world that no longer seemed to belong to him. The rain seemed endless, washing over him in waves, yet it felt as though it could never wash away the pain that clung to him. With each step, he left behind the place he had once called home, but with no clear destination in mind. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, just as the years had blurred the meaning of his own existence. He had spent so much of his life giving everything for his family, only to now find himself abandoned and forgotten. But in the midst of this cold, lonely journey, he couldn't bring himself to feel anger. Instead, there was only a deep, gnawing sadness that weighed him down like an invisible burden. As darkness began to fall, Jack found a bench in a quiet corner of the park, far from the noise of the world. There was no one around, only the sound of the rain and the occasional rustle of trees. He sat down, pulling his old, worn coat tightly around his frail body to shield himself from the biting cold. The chill seeped into his bones, but it wasn't just the cold that made him feel numb. It was the deep sense of loneliness that overwhelmed him, a loneliness that not even the rain could drown out. He wondered, as he sat there in silence, whether anyone would remember him when he was no longer the strong, capable man he had once been. Would his children still think of him when they were busy with their own lives? Would his sacrifices and the love he had given all these years mean anything now that he was no longer useful to them? The world around him seemed indifferent to his suffering. The park, once a place of life and laughter, now felt as desolate as he did. The rain continued to fall, its steady rhythm almost like a lullaby, but one that did nothing to comfort him. It only deepened his sense of isolation. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the rain wash over him, but even that couldn't drown out the voice in his mind that kept asking, what happens when you have nothing left to give? The rain became heavier, but Jack didn't move. He stayed there, lost in his thoughts, unable to escape the reality of his situation. Each drop of rain felt like a reminder that time was slipping away, and with it, any chance of reconciliation with his family. How had things gone so wrong? What had happened to the love and care he had once freely given? He didn't have the answers. All he had was the silence, the rain, and the crushing weight of regret. In that moment, Jack realized that the one thing he could never reclaim was time. The years he had spent raising his family, the sacrifices he had made, the love he had given, all of it felt like it had been swallowed up by the passage of time. He had given so much, and yet, it seemed that in the end, it had all been in vain. After kicking his father out of the house, Matthew thought he would feel a sense of relief. He believed that without the burden of caring for his father, without the constant disruptions caused by broken objects or his father's labored sighs whenever he felt frustrated, life would be easier. The house seemed quieter, devoid of the silent yet heavy conversations that had once marked his interactions with Jack. He imagined it would be simple to live with Emily and their young son, without having to endure the scrutinizing glances of his father. Yet, things did not unfold as Matthew had expected. At first, the absence of Jack in the house made everything feel strangely hollow. The silence was unnerving. There were no more murmurs of his father's voice, no more clinking of the old dishes Jack used to wash, no more soft footsteps shuffling across the floor in the early hours of the morning. What Matthew thought would bring peace instead brought him a deep sense of emptiness. The daily routine that had once been shared now seemed meaningless. He began to notice the small, insignificant details that his father used to manage, things he had taken for granted before. The house, now devoid of Jack's presence, felt sterile, as if something essential was missing. At work, things were no better. The day Matthew had hoped would come with a fresh start instead brought an unexpected series of setbacks. A major project he had been working on for weeks hit a sudden roadblock. The partners he was dealing with pulled out at the last moment, leaving Matthew to face the fallout. He could not understand why everything seemed to be going wrong, but deep down, he had a sense that the shift in his life had started affecting his work. The guilt he had been pushing aside began to resurface, eating away at his concentration. His thoughts kept returning to his father, to the harsh words he had spoken, and to the unmistakable pain in Jack's eyes when he had been told to leave. At home, things weren't any better. Emily, his wife, had become distant. She was no longer the supportive partner she once was. Instead of her usual warmth, there was a coolness between them. She would sit in the living room, her eyes filled with concern, her gaze often lingering on Matthew as if she was waiting for him to realize something. "Matthew, what are we doing?" she asked one evening, her voice soft but laden with meaning. Matthew didn't answer. He didn't know how to. How could he explain the turmoil he felt inside? How could he admit that the removal of his father from their lives had left a void so large that he wasn't sure how to fill it? Their young son, too, had begun to act out. The child, once sweet and obedient, had become stubborn, defiant, and, at times, unruly. He would yell at Matthew, mimicking the way Matthew had spoken to Jack just days earlier. "You're not the boss of me." He would shout, echoing the very same words Matthew had used in his own youth. The realization hit Matthew like a punch to the gut. He was seeing in his son the very behavior he had exhibited toward his father. His own actions, his own words, were being reflected back at him in the most painful way. Matthew tried to brush it off, convincing himself that things would get better, that this was just a phase. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. He had thought that pushing his father away would make his life easier, but instead, it had only brought about more complications. The peace he had imagined was nothing more than an illusion. The house, once a home filled with laughter and conversation, now seemed cold and unwelcoming. Every corner, every room, reminded him of the father he had cast aside. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of guilt began to press down on Matthew. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. The more he tried to distract himself with work, the more he found himself haunted by the image of his father sitting alone on that park bench, looking fragile and abandoned. It was a stark contrast to the man he had once known, strong, unwavering, and always there for him. And now, Matthew realized, his father was gone. And with him, something irreplaceable had been lost. His work was facing difficulties. A major project he had poured his heart into suddenly hit a wall when the partners cancelled the contract at the last minute. They needed someone more reliable, someone who could maintain stable relationships and avoid unnecessary risks. The partners expressed their disappointment, while Matthew stood there in silence, engulfed by a sense of helplessness. He couldn't understand why everything had collapsed so quickly. He had prepared meticulously for every detail, yet it all crumbled in an instant. Despite the frustration and disappointment that filled him, Matthew told himself he would do better next time. But deep inside, a quiet wave of anxiety began to rise. Questions about his future swirled in his mind, casting shadows over his confidence. Matthew had always prided himself on his ability to manage projects, to keep things running smoothly, but this setback felt like a blow to his very identity. The partner's words stung. He had always worked hard to prove his worth, to demonstrate that he was dependable, that he could rise above challenges. Yet now, he was being told that he wasn't enough. The trust he thought he had earned with them had vanished in a blink. He couldn't help but replay the meeting over and over in his mind, trying to pinpoint where it all went wrong. Was it the slight hesitation in his tone during the last presentation? Or was it something deeper, something he had missed all along? As the days passed, the weight of failure hung heavily on Matthew. Each time he sat at his desk, the numbers and graphs before him felt more and more like a reminder of his incompetence. He tried to distract himself with other projects, but his mind always returned to the cancelled contract. It wasn't just the financial loss or the embarrassment that stung, it was the feeling of being seen as unreliable, untrustworthy. It reminded him of how he had treated his father, how he had cast him aside when Jack was in need, thinking that distance would provide peace. But now, as Matthew grappled with the repercussions of his own actions, he realized that pushing his father away had been a mistake, just like pushing his partners away. What troubled him even more was how disconnected he felt from his family. Emily noticed his distraction, his growing distance. She would try to talk to him, but he would brush her off, absorbed in his own thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him was slipping away. He longed to confide in her, to explain how overwhelmed and uncertain he felt, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. Instead, he buried himself in work, focusing on anything that could provide a temporary escape from the gnawing sense of failure. But even that wasn't enough. As the days dragged on, the strain between them began to grow. Emily, who had always been his support, now seemed to pull away. She could see the changes in him, the way he seemed lost in his own world, distant and preoccupied. She had seen him face challenges before, but this time was different. The Matthew she had known was a man who took pride in his strength, who faced adversity head-on. But now, he seemed fragile, broken in ways that no amount of success could fix. One evening, after another long day of tension-filled silence, Emily finally confronted him. "Matthew, what's going on? You're not the man I married. You've been distant, angry, and so lost. What's happening?" Her words were soft but firm, a plea for the man she loved to come back to her. Matthew looked at her, his eyes weary, his heart heavy. He wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the night. He had always believed he could handle everything on his own, but now, in the face of these challenges, he felt more alone than ever. His mind turned back to his father, to Jack, and the harsh words he had spoken. He realized that, in pushing his father away, he had pushed away the very thing he needed most, someone who could understand his struggles, someone who had seen him through every difficult moment of his life. And now, Jack was gone, and Matthew was left to navigate this storm alone. But the deeper he searched within himself, the more he realized that he could no longer keep pretending that everything was fine. The world around him was changing, and he needed to change too. Things at home were no better. Emily, his wife, began to change. She was no longer the attentive and understanding wife she once was. Now, she seemed distant, silently sitting by herself, her eyes filled with worry whenever she glanced at Matthew. She appeared exhausted, as though she too was carrying some burden she couldn't share with him. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Emily hesitantly asked, "What have you been doing, Matthew? I feel like something's wrong. Do you know what's going on?" But her question didn't receive the response she had hoped for. Matthew simply shook his head, struggling to suppress the discomfort within him, and continued eating in a detached manner. There was a noticeable distance between them now. Emily, who had always been his pillar of support, seemed to be slipping away, and no matter how hard Matthew tried, he couldn't bridge the gap. The weight of his unspoken worries pressed down on him, and his inability to open up only made the situation worse. He had always been the strong one, the provider, the one who held everything together, but now, he found himself unable to cope, unable to communicate his inner turmoil. Emily's concern only seemed to make him feel more isolated, as if she were a reminder of everything he couldn't fix, everything that was falling apart in his life. Matthew could see the changes in her too. She no longer smiled as brightly, and the laughter that used to fill their home had faded. The warmth that had once characterized their relationship had turned cold, replaced by a silence that hung in the air. He could sense her frustration, her hurt, but he didn't know how to address it. The man he used to be, the man who could comfort her, make her feel safe, was slipping further away, and he had no idea how to get him back. But despite the growing tension, Matthew's thoughts often returned to his father, Jack. The memory of his father's frailty and the harsh words he had spoken to him weighed heavily on his conscience. He couldn't ignore the guilt that gnawed at him. He had been so focused on his own problems, his own struggles, that he had failed to see what was happening with his father. Now, Jack was gone, and Matthew regretted every moment he had spent pushing him away. He realized that by rejecting his father, he had not only lost the man who had always been there for him but also lost a piece of himself in the process. The emptiness he felt now was not just a result of his strained relationship with Emily or the failures in his career, it was the deep void left by his fractured connection with his father. Emily's question that evening seemed to echo in his mind long after they finished their meal. "Do you know what's going on?" He didn't have an answer for her, but the truth was, he didn't know what was going on with himself either. He was lost in a sea of doubt and regret, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more it consumed him. As the days passed, he realized that he could no longer avoid facing the reality of his situation. The person he had become, the way he had treated his family, his father, and himself, needed to change. But change wasn't easy, and Matthew didn't know where to begin. Matthew's young son, once the greatest joy of the family, also began to change. The boy who had been cheerful, sociable, and always making everyone laugh was now becoming rebellious, difficult to manage, sometimes irritable, and shouting for no apparent reason. During these moments, Matthew couldn't help but see his own younger self in his son, an angry child, always feeling misunderstood by his father. The boy's behavior mirrored the way Matthew had once acted toward Jack, the father he had pushed away. The shouting and stubbornness of his son were like a mirror, reflecting the same behavior Matthew had once displayed, the same rebellion he had shown when he was a child, unable to comprehend why his father couldn't understand him. Matthew felt a knot form in his stomach as he watched his son, realizing that the cycle of frustration, misunderstanding, and conflict was repeating itself in front of him. The once bright and innocent child had now become a miniature version of the discontented young Matthew he had been. It was as though the unresolved issues between him and his own father had been passed down, and now, they were being reflected in the very person who should have been the next generation's hope for a better future. Every time his son raised his voice or acted out, Matthew felt a pang of guilt. He could see how the boy was mimicking his own behavior, the same impatience, the same anger, the same inability to understand the love behind the actions of a father. Matthew couldn't ignore the fact that this was the same way he had treated Jack, and it dawned on him that in rejecting his father, he had unwittingly set an example for his son to follow. The painful irony was undeniable. By pushing Jack away, Matthew had also driven a wedge between himself and his son, perpetuating the same cycle of misunderstanding that he had experienced as a child. It was as though the universe was giving him a second chance, a chance to break the cycle, but he didn't know how to take it. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and every time he saw his son's defiant eyes or heard his frustrated cries, he was reminded of how he had once felt toward Jack, how he had pushed his father away, thinking it would make things easier. But now, he saw the consequences of that decision, not only in the strained relationship with Emily but also in the growing distance between him and his son. The more Matthew thought about it, the more he realized that his son's behavior was not just a reflection of his own actions, but also a consequence of the broken bond with Jack. It was as though his son was trying to express all the pain and confusion Matthew had never been able to voice. And in that moment, Matthew understood. His son wasn't just acting out because of some childish frustration, he was acting out because of the same unspoken hurt that Matthew had carried with him for so long. It was a moment of clarity, but it also filled Matthew with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. He knew that if he didn't find a way to break this pattern, his son would grow up carrying the same burdens he had. The thought of his son going through life with the same feelings of rejection and anger that he himself had felt was too much to bear. And so, in the midst of his own turmoil, Matthew realized that the most important thing he could do for his son, for his wife, and for himself, was to find a way to mend the broken ties of the past, to heal the wounds between him and Jack, and to create a new path for his family to follow. One afternoon, as Matthew walked past the park, he unexpectedly saw the figure of his father. Jack was sitting on a bench, looking frail and gaunt. His hands rested on his knees, and his eyes were fixed on the distance, lost in thought. His clothes were wrinkled, his old shoes worn and tattered, and there was no longer a smile on his face. All Matthew could see was an elderly man, weak and broken, as though he had endured all the hardships life had thrown at him. Matthew's heart sank. He stopped for a moment, the lump in his throat growing larger, but then he turned away, as though he didn't want to face the truth. He told himself, it was his choice. If he wants to live like that, there's nothing I can do. But deep down, he knew he was running from a truth that only he had created. The guilt began to swell inside him, but Matthew tried to push it away, not wanting to admit that he had been wrong. Everything had happened too quickly, too painfully, and he couldn't accept the truth that he had sent his father away over trivial matters, things he could have overlooked if he had only thought things through more carefully. As he walked away from the park, Matthew's mind was filled with confusion and regret. He thought back to the days when Jack had been a strong and proud man, a father who had sacrificed so much for his family. Matthew had always seen him as an inconvenience, someone whose presence added more weight to his already heavy life. But now, seeing Jack in such a pitiful state, he realized how deeply he had misunderstood him, how little he had appreciated his father's sacrifices. Matthew's thoughts were interrupted by the quiet sound of his footsteps on the pavement. He could still hear the faint echo of his father's voice in his mind, the words Jack had spoken to him during their last conversation. The words were harsh, and at the time, they had seemed unjustified. But now, as Matthew looked at his own life, he realized that the bitterness in Jack's words had been a result of the same frustration and loneliness that Matthew was now experiencing. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. He had thought that by sending Jack away, he would be freeing himself from the burden of responsibility, but in reality, he had only created a greater burden for himself. The emptiness in his home, the strained relationship with Emily, and the growing distance between him and his son were all consequences of the decision he had made. It was as if, by pushing his father away, he had set a chain of events in motion that he couldn't undo. Matthew tried to shake the thoughts from his mind, but they clung to him, relentless and unyielding. He realized that he couldn't go on like this. He needed to find a way to make things right, not just for his father, but for his family as well. He had to confront the past, confront the mistakes he had made, and find a way to heal the wounds that had been left open for so long. As he walked further away from the park, Matthew's steps became slower, more deliberate. He knew that he had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The guilt, the regret, and the anger were all part of the journey he had to take if he ever hoped to repair the damage he had done. The first step was acknowledging that he had made a mistake and that, perhaps, it wasn't too late to fix it. For the first time in a long while, Matthew allowed himself to feel vulnerable. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that he didn't need his father. But now, standing at the crossroads of his life, he realized that those walls had only kept him isolated and broken. The only way forward was to tear them down and start over, no matter how difficult that might be. A week later, Matthew received a phone call from Mr. Henry, an old friend of his father. Henry's voice was filled with reproach and concern, as though he was about to reveal a truth Matthew had never known. "Matthew, do you know what your father did for you?" Henry asked, his tone heavy with reproach. "He was once a skilled engineer, but he gave up his career to raise you. He sold the family home, worked tirelessly day and night just so you could have the opportunity to study abroad. Do you really think you could have stood on your own without him?" Henry's words hit Matthew like a thunderclap, stunning him into silence. He stood frozen, as if the very air had been knocked out of him. His chest tightened, and a wave of guilt washed over him. For so long, Matthew had taken for granted the sacrifices his father had made for him. He had never once stopped to consider the depth of Jack's commitment, the sacrifices that had shaped his entire life. His mind raced back to his childhood, to the memories he had pushed aside, the long hours Jack had spent at work, the absence of his father's presence during his formative years, and the quiet, unspoken love Jack had shown through his actions rather than words. Matthew had always felt the burden of his father's expectations, but now he saw the weight of his father's sacrifices in a completely different light. Jack had not only sacrificed his career, his home, and his dreams, but he had done it all with the hope that Matthew would have a chance at a better life. Matthew sat down, feeling as though the ground beneath him was giving way. He had been so focused on his own struggles, his own frustrations, that he had failed to see the quiet, unrelenting sacrifices his father had made to ensure he had everything he needed. The realization hit him hard. Jack had given up everything for him, his happiness, his health, his sense of self, and Matthew had repaid that with coldness, impatience, and indifference. The guilt consumed him, and he could no longer hold back the tears that had been building up inside him. His father's image, the frail, lonely man he had rejected, suddenly became a symbol of everything he had failed to appreciate. He had pushed Jack away in his pride and selfishness, unable to recognize the depth of his father's love until it was too late. Henry. Matthew's voice cracked, barely able to speak through the knot in his throat. What should I do? His mind was in a whirlwind, full of regrets and unanswered questions. He had been wrong, so terribly wrong, and now, he didn't know how to make things right. Henry's voice softened, though still heavy with concern. You need to find him, Matthew. Your father needs you, and you need him. Don't wait until it's too late. You owe him that much. Matthew hung up the phone, his mind racing. There was no time to waste. He had to find his father, apologize, and somehow make amends for the pain he had caused. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, but he knew that redemption was possible, if only he could muster the courage to face the truth and seek forgiveness. Without wasting another moment, Matthew grabbed his jacket and left the house. He had no idea where Jack might be, but he knew that he couldn't let the distance between them grow any wider. He had to fix this, for his father and for himself. The memories of his father began to flood back. Matthew recalled the days of his childhood, when his father was still strong and always by his side, whether it was during study sessions, outings, or moments when he faced challenges. Jack had never complained, never asked for anything, only ever sacrificed quietly for his son. Now, Matthew realized that all those sacrifices were invaluable, and he had overlooked them for petty reasons he hadn't even considered. He remembered the late nights when his father stayed up working, taking on extra jobs to make money to send him abroad for his studies. He remembered the image of his father carrying him to school on rainy days, even though his legs were no longer as quick as they once were. All of these images filled him with a deep sense of shame for how he had treated his father. Each memory felt like a sharp pang of regret, cutting into the pride he had once held onto. Matthew had always taken Jack's sacrifices for granted, assuming that his father's actions were just a natural part of being a parent. But now, with the clarity of hindsight, he understood the enormity of those sacrifices. He had been blind to the silent struggles Jack had endured to give him a better life. The more Matthew thought about it, the more his chest tightened with guilt. How could he have been so selfish? How could he have ever thought that his father's presence was a burden rather than a blessing? The answers seemed so clear now, yet the realization came too late. His father had given up everything for him, and yet, Matthew had rejected him when he needed him most. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Matthew's eyes welled up with tears. He couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to repair the damage he had done. Was his father still out there, waiting for him? Or had Jack, in his quiet dignity, already given up on him, knowing that his son would never truly understand the depth of his love? The fear that he had lost his father forever was a heavy burden that Matthew couldn't bear. But there was no time for regrets now. He had to act, and he had to act quickly. There had to be a way to make things right. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could make amends, show his father the love and appreciation he had always deserved. And maybe, just maybe, his father would still be willing to give him the forgiveness that only a parent could offer. With renewed determination, Matthew wiped away the tears, clenched his fists, and made his way out the door. He didn't know where to start, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to stop until he found his father. Matthew felt as though he had just woken up from a terrible nightmare, as if he had been blind for too long and was only now realizing the truth. He understood that everything Mr. Henry had said was true. Jack, the aging father he had cast out, had given his entire life to ensure that Matthew could have the opportunities he now enjoyed. It felt as if he had wounded someone irreplaceable, and all of it was because of the impulsive actions of his youth. The weight of his mistake pressed heavily on his chest, suffocating him with guilt. He couldn't believe that he had rejected his father, the very man who had sacrificed so much for him. Jack had spent years building a future for Matthew, working tirelessly, giving up his own dreams to create a better life for his son. And yet, Matthew had thrown all that away without a second thought, too caught up in his own frustrations and self-pity to see the bigger picture. He had been selfish, focused on his own immediate discomfort and feeling burdened by his father's presence, unaware of the immense love and sacrifice that had always been there. The image of his father sitting alone in the park, cold and abandoned, burned into his mind. It was a haunting reminder of how far he had pushed Jack, and now, it felt like there was no way to undo the hurt. But deep down, Matthew knew he had to make things right. He couldn't change the past, but he had to try to salvage what was left. He couldn't stand the thought of his father living the rest of his days in loneliness, rejected by the one person who should have appreciated him the most. Determined to find his father, Matthew made a vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to show Jack how deeply sorry he was. He didn't know if his father would ever forgive him, but he had to try. For the first time in years, Matthew felt the weight of responsibility not just for his own life, but for the life of the man who had shaped his future. He could no longer afford to be the son who took everything for granted. It was time to be the man his father had always believed him to be. Immediately, Matthew felt a wave of feverish emotion rise within him. He quickly abandoned his work, rushing to the park, the place where he had seen his father just days ago. When he arrived, he found Jack still sitting on the same old bench, his eyes staring into the distance, as though lost in memories of days long past. Matthew dropped to his knees before his father, his eyes brimming with tears. He felt the weight of shame and regret surging through every corner of his heart. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I don't deserve to be your son," Matthew said, his voice choked with emotion as the tears spilled down his face. Jack looked at his son, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the weight of the silence thick between them. Matthew, in that instant, realized just how much time had passed without him acknowledging his father's sacrifices, without truly understanding the depth of Jack's love for him. Jack's weathered face softened as he gazed at his son, his eyes showing traces of the old affection that had once been so constant between them. He reached out a trembling hand, gently placing it on Matthew's shoulder. "Son," Jack whispered, his voice filled with both sorrow and a hint of relief. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Matthew could barely believe the forgiveness in his father's words. After all the hurt, after the years of neglect and rejection, Jack was still willing to forgive him, still willing to open his heart. "Please, Dad," Matthew choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I promise, I will never turn my back on you again. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the years I've lost." Jack gave a small, sad smile, his tired eyes filled with love, despite everything. "I never wanted anything from you but your love. We all make mistakes, Matthew. It's not too late to fix things." Matthew collapsed into his father's embrace, feeling the weight of the years they had lost and the newfound hope that bloomed between them. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of home. Jack looked up at his son, his eyes filled with sorrow but devoid of any anger or reproach. He sighed softly, then spoke in a gentle tone, "Have you finally understood, Matthew? A parent's love is not something that can be measured or counted. I don't blame you, but what I want is for you to live well, to appreciate your family. All I've ever wanted is for you to be happy and to love the people who are close to you." Matthew felt the weight of his father's words sink deep into his heart. The pain he had been carrying for so long, the regret, the guilt, all seemed to fade away as he listened to Jack's simple yet profound message. It was as if the years of misunderstanding and hurt were starting to unravel, replaced by something that was more important, understanding, acceptance, and the beginning of healing. He had spent so much time fighting against his father's love, thinking he needed to prove something to the world, to himself. But now, sitting here with his father, he realized that love was never about proving anything. It was about being present, being there for one another, through all their ups and downs, no matter how hard it got. And in that moment, Matthew understood just how precious and irreplaceable his family was. "I will, Dad," Matthew whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'll make sure I never forget how much you've sacrificed for me. I promise I'll be better for you, for Emily, for our son. I won't take any of this for granted again." Jack reached out and placed a worn hand on Matthew's cheek, the touch surprisingly warm despite his frailty. That's all I ever needed to hear, son. Remember, it's never too late to start over, to change, and to cherish what matters most. Family is everything. For the first time in a long while, Matthew felt the weight of his past lifted. His father's forgiveness, unconditional and pure, gave him a new sense of purpose and direction. There were still many things to rebuild, many bridges to mend, but at least now, he was ready to try. Ready to live a life that honored the love and sacrifices that had been given to him. Matthew cried uncontrollably, holding his father tightly in his arms. For the first time in many years, he felt the warmth from the aging hands of the father he had abandoned. This feeling was not just one of regret but a deep awakening within him. He understood that while the past couldn't be undone, the future was still in his hands. From that moment on, he vowed to live differently, to live with more appreciation for those he loved and for the family that had stood by him. The bond between father and son had been mended, and though there was still much to be done, Matthew knew that he had taken the first step toward healing. The weight of his past mistakes, the resentment, the frustration, it was all beginning to fade. What mattered now was the present, and the future he could build with the people who mattered most. He pulled away slightly to look into Jack's face, his tear-filled eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I won't waste any more time," Matthew whispered, voice cracking with emotion. "I'll make sure you know how much you mean to me. I'll make up for everything." Jack smiled softly, his eyes misty but peaceful. "Just be there when it matters. That's all I need, Matthew." Matthew nodded, feeling the weight of the words sink in. His father was right, what he needed to do now was simple: be there. Be present. Show love, respect, and gratitude for the people who gave him everything. As they sat together on the park bench, the world around them seemed a little brighter, a little more hopeful. The years of distance and regret didn't disappear overnight, but for the first time in a long while, Matthew felt like he was on the right path, one where love and family were the true priorities. He hugged Jack once more, silently promising that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where he would never take his loved ones for granted again. After that event, Matthew's life changed dramatically. He began to spend more time with his family, especially with his father. What once seemed like a burden had now become a precious gift. Instead of being consumed by work or social appointments, Matthew and Jack would sit on the porch together in the evenings, sipping tea and talking. Jack's stories, though rooted in the past, made Matthew feel closer to him than ever before. The memories Jack shared were vivid, recounting the struggles he faced when he was young, the obstacles he had to overcome to provide for his family, and the sacrifices he had made without ever asking for anything in return. But now, as Jack spoke, there was a lightness in his voice. He laughed freely, his laughter genuine and warm, as if time had helped him find peace within himself. He wasn't burdened by the past anymore. The pain, the hardship, had faded into memories, and all that remained was a deep love for his family and a sense of fulfillment for the life he had lived. Matthew sat, listening intently, his heart full of gratitude. He realized how much he had missed by pushing his father away for so many years. Now, every conversation, every shared memory, felt like a treasure, a bond being rebuilt slowly but surely. Those quiet evenings on the porch became their sanctuary, a space for connection and reflection. For Matthew, they were moments of growth, understanding, and healing. He learned to appreciate not only the wisdom of his father but the depth of the love that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. It was no longer just about the big, grand gestures, it was in these small, simple moments where love and family were expressed most clearly. In time, Jack's health began to deteriorate, as expected with age. But Matthew was ready. He had come to terms with the impermanence of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. He was there for his father, as Jack had always been there for him, and this time, he wasn't going to let go. Their relationship, once broken, had been restored not through grand gestures, but through quiet moments of understanding, patience, and love. What mattered now was not the past, but the present, and for Matthew, that was enough. Matthew couldn't change the past, but he promised himself that he would do everything in his power to make up for the lost time with his father in the years that remained. He vowed he would never let Jack endure loneliness again. He understood now that time, once gone, could never be reclaimed. And more than that, he realized how crucial it was to cherish the loved ones around him. Life didn't offer do-overs, and sometimes, second chances weren't guaranteed. Every day with his father was a gift, a precious moment he could no longer take for granted. Matthew became more present, at home, with Jack, with his family. He found ways to show his love through actions, big and small, to express gratitude for the sacrifices his father had made. Whether it was cooking dinner together, taking Jack to his doctor's appointments, or simply sitting quietly and enjoying each other's company, Matthew made sure to fill the days with meaning. He no longer viewed his relationship with his father as a duty, but as a privilege, a chance to create new memories and restore the bond that had been fractured for so long. In these moments, he discovered what it truly meant to love and be loved unconditionally. And for the first time in years, Matthew felt a sense of peace. He had made things right with his father, and more importantly, he had come to understand the depth of the love that had always been there, waiting for him to embrace it. The family was no longer just a distant concept to Matthew, it was something he actively nurtured. He made an effort to connect with his wife, Emily, and their child, showing them the love and affection he had neglected before. He saw the value of family not just in the grand moments, but in the small, quiet exchanges, shared meals, bedtime stories, laughter around the dinner table. Through this new perspective, Matthew had transformed. He understood that life was fleeting, and the people he loved were not guaranteed to be there forever. He had learned to live fully in the present, to honor those who mattered, and to never again take for granted the time he had with them. The lessons of the past, though painful, had given him the wisdom to embrace the future with a heart full of love and a deep appreciation for the fleeting moments that made life truly rich. The message of this story is a profound lesson about family love and the silent sacrifices that often go unnoticed until it's too late. In this life, we are often swept away by the fast pace of work, personal concerns, and social relationships, forgetting those loved ones who are right beside us. Fathers, mothers, and family members are the ones who quietly sacrifice, care for, and protect us without asking for anything in return. They are the steadfast support during the toughest moments of our lives. They are the ones who are willing to give up their own happiness and personal joys to create the best opportunities for us. This sacrifice is often invisible, not immediately recognized, and is not always repaid as it should be. It is only when we lose or hurt these loved ones that we realize their true value and the sacrifices they made for us. When life pushes us into difficult situations, when we are tired and in pain, we begin to see that our family members are our greatest source of encouragement and strength, helping us to overcome any obstacles. The love of family, no matter how many challenges it faces, remains the most enduring and reliable, the place where we can always find peace and hope. In the rush of daily life, it's easy to take family for granted, thinking they will always be there. But the truth is, we must never forget the preciousness of those bonds. We often miss the little gestures, the silent support, and the endless sacrifices that are woven into the fabric of family life. The true meaning of love and care comes not from grand gestures, but from the consistent, unwavering presence of those who love us most. As we navigate the complexities of our lives, it is essential to stop, reflect, and acknowledge the importance of these relationships. Only then can we begin to truly appreciate and cherish the family that stands behind us. This story reminds us to cherish our loved ones while we still can and not wait until we lose them to feel regret. Sometimes, the opportunity to fix mistakes or express gratitude does not always come. Time waits for no one, and once something is lost, it cannot be reclaimed. Therefore, we must treasure every moment spent with our family, not letting small conflicts or disagreements cloud the love and bond within our home. We need to learn how to love, forgive, and live responsibly with those we care about, because family is a precious gift that life gives to each of us. In our busy lives, it's easy to take for granted those who are always by our side. However, the importance of family cannot be overstated. It is the foundation of our existence and the source of unconditional support. The love within a family is irreplaceable, and it grows stronger with time, not weaker. We should strive to appreciate our family members every day, not just in times of need, but always. It is through understanding, patience, and compassion that we truly foster strong, loving relationships. By nurturing these relationships, we also build a legacy of love that can last for generations. The bonds we create with our family shape who we are, and they provide the foundation for our personal growth. When we take the time to care for and respect those closest to us, we are not only honoring them, but we are also enriching our own lives with the warmth, security, and love that come from genuine family connections. So, take every opportunity to make amends, express love, and be there for your loved ones. Don't wait for regret to be the teacher, let love and gratitude guide your actions every day. Thank you for supporting me in this video. I'll see you next time, and don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe.